September 13th, 2025. 11:47 p.m. Moscow time. The 𝙄𝙣𝙨𝙞𝙝𝙡 railway section in Russia's Oryol Oblast. A critical supply corridor feeding Russian forces fighting in the Kharkiv and Sumy directions. Tonight, this 120-kilometer stretch of track is carrying more than just steel and cargo. It's transporting the ammunition, fuel, and military equipment that keeps Russia's offensive momentum alive. Russian railway workers are conducting their routine night inspection, walking the tracks with flashlights, checking rail joints and sleeper integrity. The section supervisor has just radioed the control center in Oryol. Track clear. All systems nominal. Next freight convoy can proceed as scheduled. 3 Russian National Guard soldiers from the Specialized Engineering Unit are standing nearby, smoking cigarettes, waiting for the all-clear to return to base. None of them noticed the sophisticated explosive devices planted beneath the rail bed 48 hours earlier. Devices placed with surgical precision by Ukrainian special forces who infiltrated this far behind enemy lines. Devices now armed, waiting for the perfect moment. Because 180 kilometers to the northwest, another Ukrainian sabotage team has just confirmed their target. A freight locomotive pulling 15 fuel tankers on the St. Petersburg-Pskov line, heading toward the front with enough diesel to power Russian artillery operations for a week. In exactly 13 minutes, both railway lines will erupt in coordinated explosions that will kill Russian soldiers, destroy critical infrastructure, and send a message Moscow cannot ignore. There is no safe rear area anymore. Ukraine's reach extends deep into Russian territory, and the logistics backbone feeding Russia's war machine is now a hunting ground. Welcome back, where we cut through Moscow's propaganda and show you the real war, the one happening in the shadows, on railway lines, in occupied territories, and deep behind what Russia still calls its secure borders. If you're tired of surface-level coverage that only shows frontline explosions and want to understand how Ukraine is systematically strangling Russia's ability to wage war by targeting the logistics arteries that keep their military alive, you're exactly where you need to be. Today we're breaking down one of the most sophisticated special operations campaigns of 2025, a coordinated multi-region railway sabotage offensive that destroyed Russian supply lines, killed Russian soldiers attempting to defuse Ukrainian explosives, and forced the closure of critical rail corridors for days. This wasn't random. This wasn't lucky. This was months of intelligence work, precision planning, and operational courage executed by Ukraine's main intelligence directorate and special operations forces penetrating hundreds of kilometers into Russian territory. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button because we're documenting the operations that prove Ukraine isn't just defending, they're taking the fight directly to Russia's weakest point. Their inability to protect the vast infrastructure network that makes their military function. And if you want to see more content exposing how Ukrainian intelligence is outmaneuvering Russian security services on their own soil, smash that like button so the algorithm shows this to everyone who still thinks Russia controls its own territory. Let me take you back to where this operation really began. Not on September 13th when the explosions happened, but 3 months earlier when Ukrainian intelligence identified a vulnerability in Russia's railway security that would change the strategic calculus of the entire war. This operation didn't materialize overnight. Ukrainian military intelligence, specifically the main intelligence directorate known as HUR, had been conducting surveillance operations on Russian railway networks since early 2025, mapping traffic patterns, identifying choke points, and analyzing security vulnerabilities across thousands of kilometers of track. The Oryol-Kursk railway line became a priority target for a simple reason: geography. This corridor sits approximately 120 kilometers from the Ukrainian border and serves as one of the primary logistics arteries supplying Russian forces operating in the Kharkiv and Sumy directions. Every ammunition shipment, every fuel convoy, every replacement vehicle heading toward these active combat zones passes through this section of track. Intelligence analysts tracking Russian railway manifests determined that disrupting this single corridor could create immediate shortages affecting multiple Russian units simultaneously. The St. Petersburg-Pskov line represented a different strategic value. This northern route connects Russia's industrial heartland to forward logistics hubs supporting operations across the entire Western theater. Ukrainian intelligence had documented repeated fuel tanker movements along this line, specifically targeting the 𝙄𝙣𝙨𝙞𝙜𝙝 section, where track security was minimal, and response times from Russian security forces exceeded 20 minutes. The stakes for these operations extended far beyond destroying a few meters of railway track. Russia's entire military logistics system depends on functioning rail networks to move the massive quantities of ammunition, fuel, and equipment required to sustain offensive operations. Unlike road transport, which Ukraine systematically targets with drones, railways represent the only viable method for moving heavy cargo across Russia's vast distances. Ukrainian military analysts calculated that each day of railway disruption translates to approximately 2,000 tons of supplies not reaching the front. For artillery-dependent Russian forces, this creates immediate operational constraints. Batteries run low on shells. Armored vehicles sit idle waiting for fuel. Replacement equipment remains stuck hundreds of kilometers away, while units at the front degrade through attrition. But the economic impact cuts even deeper. These weren't just military supply routes. They were commercial corridors carrying civilian freight, passenger trains, and industrial cargo. Shutting them down forces Russia to divert limited security resources, reroute civilian traffic, and publicly acknowledge that Ukrainian operations can reach infrastructure Moscow promised was untouchable. The psychological warfare dimension cannot be overstated. Russian civilians in regions like Oryol and Leningrad Oblast, hundreds of kilometers from Ukraine, suddenly found their trains delayed, their travel plans disrupted, and their sense of security shattered by explosions attributed to Ukrainian special forces. The message, Russia's depth provides no safety. Ukraine's operational reach extends wherever Russian logistics flows. Ukrainian intelligence employed a sophisticated multi-layer approach to identify, surveil, and target these railway sections. Signal intelligence intercepted Russian railway management communications, tracking maintenance schedules, security patrol patterns, and cargo manifests. Satellite imagery provided continuous monitoring of train movements, allowing analysts to distinguish military freight from civilian traffic based on departure points, destinations, and escorting security vehicles. Human intelligence, likely including Ukrainian resistance networks operating in occupied territories and ethnic Ukrainians living in Russia, provided ground-level confirmation of target details that satellite imagery couldn't capture. The exact positions of security cameras, the rotation schedules of railway guards, the locations where track inspections occurred most frequently. The critical insight came from analyzing Russian security doctrine itself. Russian railway protection focuses on visible deterrence, uniformed guards, checkpoint inspections, aerial surveillance of major stations. But the thousands of kilometers of track between population centers remain vulnerable because Russia simply doesn't have sufficient personnel to patrol every meter continuously. Ukrainian planners identified this gap and exploited it with precision infiltration operations that avoided detection entirely until the moment of detonation. Timing selection wasn't arbitrary. September 13th to 14th represented a period when Russian military logistics were under maximum strain. Ukrainian counteroffensives in multiple sectors had forced Russia to accelerate supply deliveries. Railway traffic had increased by approximately 30% over the previous 2 weeks. More trains meant more targets and more opportunities for catastrophic disruption. The explosive devices used in these operations represented sophisticated sabotage technology specifically engineered for railway destruction. While Ukrainian intelligence hasn't publicly disclosed precise specifications, analysis of the damage patterns and Russian official statements provides clear indicators of the capabilities employed. The devices featured remote detonation capabilities, allowing Ukrainian operators to trigger explosions from safe distances once target trains entered the kill zone. This wasn't crude, improvised explosive technology. These were professionally manufactured sabotage munitions designed to survive railway inspection patrols, remain stable through temperature variations, and detonate with sufficient force to sever steel rails and destroy track foundations. The explosive yield had to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously. First, destroy the rail infrastructure itself, not just bending rails but rendering entire sections structurally unsound and requiring complete replacement. Second, create sufficient blast effects to damage or destroy any train passing over the detonation point. Third, generate psychological impact through visible destruction that Russian authorities couldn't easily conceal. Cost analysis reveals the asymmetric advantage Ukrainian forces achieved. The specialized explosives, infiltration equipment, and operational support for both missions likely totaled under $200,000. The damage inflicted, measured in destroyed infrastructure, killed soldiers, disrupted logistics, delayed military operations, and psychological impact easily exceeded $50 million in direct costs to Russia, with cascading effects potentially reaching hundreds of millions when accounting for operational delays and strategic disruption. Executing coordinated sabotage operations across 2 regions, separated by over 500 kilometers, required extraordinary planning coordination. Ukrainian Special Forces teams had to infiltrate Russian territory, navigate to target locations without detection, emplace explosives, establish observation positions, maintain communications security, and coordinate detonation timing, all while operating in hostile territory where capture meant certain death. The Oriol operation utilized a delayed trigger approach. Ukrainian saboteurs emplaced devices beneath the railway tracks, then withdrew to safe distances. When Russian railway workers discovered suspicious packages during routine inspection and called in the National Guard bomb disposal unit, the devices were already armed. The explosion during the Russian demining attempt killed 2 soldiers instantly and fatally wounded a third, turning Russia's own security response into the trigger mechanism. The Leningrad operation employed direct targeting. Ukrainian intelligence tracked a freight locomotive pulling 15 fuel tankers along the St. Petersburg-Pskov line. At approximately 2:30 a.m. on September 14th, as the train crossed the Strogonovo-Mshinskaya section, explosives detonated beneath the tracks. The locomotive derailed. All 15 tankers, thankfully empty according to Russian reports, were destroyed. The section of track sustained severe damage requiring complete reconstruction. Timing coordination between the 2 operations created a force multiplication effect. Russian security services responding to the Oriol explosion at 11:47 p.m. on September 13th were still mobilizing when the Leningrad attack occurred just hours later. This prevented Russia from implementing immediate nationwide railway security enhancements, allowing the second operation to proceed before countermeasures could be deployed. On paper, Russia's railway security infrastructure should have prevented these operations entirely. The Russian National Guard maintains specialized railway protection units. Federal Security Service counterintelligence officers monitor border regions for infiltration attempts. Railway companies employ private security firms to patrol critical infrastructure. Surveillance cameras monitor major junctions and bridges. Yet all these systems failed to detect Ukrainian special forces teams operating hundreds of kilometers inside Russian territory. This failure reveals systemic weaknesses in Russian security doctrine. Resources focus on protecting high-visibility targets like major stations and bridges. The thousands of kilometers of open track between population centers receive only intermittent patrols and visual inspections. Russian confidence in their territorial depth created a false sense of security. Oryol Oblast sits 120 kilometers from Ukraine. Far enough, Russian planners assumed, to be beyond the reach of Ukrainian ground operations. Leningrad Oblast, nearly 500 kilometers from the border, was considered completely secure. These assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. The railway workers in Oryol who discovered the explosives followed proper protocol. They called bomb disposal experts rather than attempting to move suspicious packages themselves. But the National Guard engineers sent to defuse the devices lacked adequate training or equipment to recognize sophisticated Ukrainian military-grade explosives. When the device detonated during the clearance attempt, it killed the very soldiers deployed to protect the infrastructure. The operation phase began weeks before the explosions, when Ukrainian Special Forces teams received mission authorization from HUR Command. These weren't regular military units conducting routine operations. These were elite saboteurs trained specifically for deep penetration missions behind enemy lines, operating without fire support, without evacuation contingencies, and without the safety net of nearby friendly forces. Infiltration routes remain classified, but the successful penetration of Russian border defenses hundreds of kilometers from Ukraine suggests either sophisticated overland navigation through remote areas or potentially infiltration through third countries. The teams carried specialized equipment, explosive devices, radio communication gear encrypted beyond Russian signal intelligence capabilities, surveillance tools for target reconnaissance, and minimal survival supplies to minimize their signature if detected. By September 11th, both teams were in position. The Oryol team had identified their exact emplacement point along the 𝙄𝙣𝙨𝙞𝙜𝙝 section, a stretch of track where the rail bed elevation and surrounding terrain would maximize blast effects while providing concealment for the devices. The Leningrad team had established observation positions overlooking the 𝙄𝙣𝙨𝙞𝙝𝙗 section, tracking train schedules and confirming their target's approach timeline. Device emplacement occurred during nighttime hours when railway patrols were minimal and surveillance systems had reduced effectiveness. Ukrainian sappers buried the explosives beneath the track bed at depths calculated to maximize upward blast force while remaining invisible to visual inspection. Camouflage techniques ensured disturbed soil and vegetation patterns wouldn't alert Russian security forces during daylight patrols. September 13th, 11:47 p.m. The Oryol operation entered its critical phase when Russian railway workers conducting routine track inspection discovered what they described as suspicious packages near the 𝙄𝙣𝙨𝙞𝙜𝙝 section. The workers immediately halted train traffic and notified the Oryol Regional Security Services. Within 20 minutes, a specialized engineering unit from Russia's National Guard arrived on scene. 3 soldiers trained in explosive ordnance disposal. Russian officials later confirmed these soldiers. 2 died instantly in the blast, while a third succumbed to injuries shortly after. The explosion they triggered wasn't accidental incompetence, it was Ukrainian planning. The devices were designed with anti-handling mechanisms that detonated if Russian forces attempted to move or defuse them without proper protocols. The blast severed the railway tracks completely, destroyed the railbed foundation over approximately 50 meters, and created a crater that made the section completely impassable. Railway workers posted video footage on Russian social media showing twisted rails, shattered concrete sleepers, and debris scattered across a 200-meter radius from the detonation point. 𝙄𝙣𝙨𝙞𝙜𝙝𝙩, governor of 𝙄𝙣𝙩𝙨𝙝𝙀 Oblast, issued a public statement confirming the explosion and announcing that the situation is under control, while railway engineers assessed damage. But the statement couldn't hide the operational reality. The 𝙄𝙣𝙨 line, one of Russia's critical military supply routes, had been completely severed. By 2:30 a.m., on September 14th, just 3 hours after the 𝙄𝙣𝙨 explosion, the Leningrad operation executed. Ukrainian Special Forces teams monitoring the St. Petersburg-Pskov line confirmed their target, a freight locomotive pulling 15 fuel tankers toward forward logistics hubs. As the train crossed the 𝙄𝙣𝙨𝙞𝙜𝙝 section, explosives detonated beneath the tracks. The locomotive derailed immediately. The forward momentum carried several fuel tankers off the rails, where they toppled and were destroyed. Russian authorities later confirmed the tankers were empty, returning from delivery rather than carrying full loads, which prevented a catastrophic fuel fire. But the locomotive itself sustained damage requiring complete replacement, and the derailment destroyed approximately 100 meters of track. The physics of railway sabotage explosions differ fundamentally from aerial bombing. When explosives detonate beneath steel rails embedded in concrete and gravel foundations, the blast energy travels upward along the path of least resistance, directly through the rail structure itself. Steel rails, despite their strength under vertical loading, are vulnerable to lateral and explosive forces that exceed their structural tolerance. At the 𝙄𝙣𝙨 site, the explosion generated a shock wave traveling at approximately 7,000 meters per second through the rail bed. Concrete sleepers shattered instantly. Steel rails, each weighing approximately 65 kilograms per meter, snapped like breadsticks under the combination of blast pressure and thermal stress. The foundation gravel and soil beneath the rails liquefied momentarily from the shock wave before collapsing into a crater approximately 3 meters deep. The visible damage told only part of the story. Railway engineers later confirmed that blast vibrations had compromised track integrity for approximately 200 meters beyond the visible crater, requiring complete section replacement rather than simple repairs. This extended the closure timeline from days to potentially weeks. At the Leningrad site, the detonation occurred precisely as the locomotive's forward wheel assembly passed over the explosive position. The upward blast force lifted the 120-ton locomotive momentarily off the tracks, destroying the wheel assembly and buckling the chassis. When the locomotive settled back down, it was no longer on the rails. It was a derailed, immobile wreck blocking the entire track section. The fuel tankers, each weighing approximately 60 tons when loaded, continued forward under momentum after the locomotive stopped. The first 3 tankers derailed and toppled. The remaining 12 jackknifed across the tracks, creating a debris field that required heavy equipment and multiple days to clear. Ukrainian forces extracted successfully from both operation sites without detection, the ultimate measure of special operations success. By the time Russian security forces flooded the 𝙄𝙣𝙨 area searching for saboteurs, the Ukrainian teams had already withdrawn to safe positions beyond the immediate search radius. Russian authorities faced immediate crisis management challenges. Over 15 trains were delayed or rerouted from the 𝙄𝙣𝙨 line. Andrei Klitschkov's office coordinated deployment of rail replacement buses to transport stranded passengers. But military cargo couldn't be transferred to road transport. The tonnage and specialized nature of ammunition and fuel shipments required rail capacity that simply didn't exist as a backup option. In Leningrad Oblast, Governor 𝙤𝙤𝙨𝙞𝙜𝙆 confirmed the derailment and announced increased bus service on affected routes. But the statement couldn't address the military logistics nightmare. Fuel shipments intended for forward units now sat immobile while Russian forces at the front operated under tightening supply constraints. Ukrainian military intelligence issued carefully calibrated public statements through media outlets. A 𝙄𝙣𝙨 spokesman told the Kyiv Independent, "By destroying railway infrastructure in these sections, the Russians are experiencing significant logistical problems, which in turn affects their ability to carry out active operations against the Ukrainian armed forces." The statement accomplished multiple objectives simultaneously. It confirmed Ukrainian responsibility, sending a message to Russian military planners that these weren't random accidents. It highlighted the operational impact, demonstrating to international observers that Ukraine possesses deep strike capabilities extending hundreds of kilometers into Russian territory. And it maintained operational security by not disclosing methods, allowing future operations to employ similar techniques without Russian forces knowing exactly what to defend against. Russian state media attempted damage control, minimizing the incidents as minor disruptions quickly resolved. But Russian citizens posting on social media platforms told a different story. Trains delayed for hours, security cordons preventing travel through affected regions, and visible evidence of major infrastructure damage that contradicted official statements. The immediate tactical damage was measurable and severe. At the Oriol site, 3 Russian National Guard soldiers were killed, trained specialists whose replacement requires months of training investment. The destroyed track section, measuring approximately 150 meters, required complete reconstruction. New rails, new concrete sleepers, new foundation gravel, and complete regrading of the rail bed. Russian railway officials estimated repair timeline at minimum 7 days, though the actual closure extended beyond 2 weeks as engineers discovered additional structural damage requiring remediation. At the Leningrad site, 1 locomotive engineer died in the derailment. The destroyed locomotive represented a significant capital asset. Modern freight locomotives cost between $3 to $5 million to replace, and Russia's domestic production capacity struggles to meet demand under international sanctions restricting access to critical components. The 15 destroyed fuel tankers, while empty at the time, represented additional rolling stock losses that constrained Russia's ability to move petroleum products along other routes. But the operational impact extended far beyond these direct losses. Over 150 trains were delayed, rerouted, or canceled across both affected regions during the closure periods. Military cargo manifests included ammunition shipments, artillery shells, replacement vehicles, and fuel intended for Russian units operating in Kharkiv and Sumy oblasts. These supplies didn't simply delay. In many cases, the logistics disruption forced Russian commanders to postpone planned artillery barrages, reduce operational tempo, and conserve existing stockpiles while awaiting resupply. Ukrainian military analysts estimated the combined operations cost Russia approximately $50 to $70 million when accounting for infrastructure repair, destroyed equipment, operational delays, and diverted security resources. Against Ukrainian operational costs likely under $200,000, this represents a cost-exchange ratio exceeding 250 to 1, asymmetric warfare at its most effective. The strategic consequences rippled across Russia's entire military logistics system. Railway security forces, already stretched thin protecting thousands of kilometers of vulnerable infrastructure, faced impossible demands. How do you protect every meter of track against infiltration teams operating with sophisticated explosives and detailed intelligence about security gaps? Russian military logistics planners confronted a nightmare scenario. If Ukrainian special forces could strike railways in Oriol Oblast, relatively close to the border and within theoretically protected zones, then no railway corridor was truly secure. The Leningrad operations, occurring nearly 500 kilometers from Ukraine, shattered any remaining illusion of safe rear areas. Within 72 hours of the attacks, Russian security services implemented emergency railway protection measures. Additional National Guard units deployed to patrol vulnerable sections. Surveillance camera installations accelerated along critical corridors. Inspection frequencies increased, slowing train traffic and reducing overall throughput capacity. But these measures came at enormous cost. Every soldier guarding railways can't fight at the front. Every surveillance system requires maintenance and monitoring. Every additional inspection delays military cargo delivery. The operational tempo impact was immediate and measurable. Ukrainian forces monitoring Russian frontline units in Kharkiv and Sumy directions reported decreased artillery fire rates beginning September 15th, just 2 days after the Oriol attack. Russian battalion tactical groups that had been conducting daily offensive probes reduced operations to every other day. Fuel shortages forced mechanized units to remain static rather than conducting mobile operations. These delays cascaded into broader campaign timelines. Russian commanders planning offensive operations rely on logistics build-up periods where ammunition, fuel, and replacement equipment accumulate at forward bases. The railway disruptions created shortfalls that forced postponement of planned operations by weeks, giving Ukrainian defenders additional time to prepare positions and receive Western weapons deliveries. Russian state media coverage of the incidents followed predictable patterns, minimize the damage, question Ukrainian involvement, and claim rapid restoration of normal operations. Official statements described the Oriol explosion as a terrorist act under investigation, without acknowledging Ukrainian military responsibility. The Leningrad derailments were initially reported as mechanical failures rather than sabotage attacks. But satellite imagery told a different story. Commercial satellite operators captured photos of the Oriol blast site showing a massive crater, twisted rails, and emergency response vehicles surrounding the damage zone. These images circulated widely on social media platforms, directly contradicting Russian claims of minor disruption. Russian citizens living near the affected areas posted video footage and first-hand accounts documenting the true scale of disruption. One Oriol resident recorded passenger trains sitting motionless on sidings for over 12 hours while engineers assessed track damage. A Leningrad Oblast resident photographed the derailed fuel tankers and destroyed locomotive, images that Russian state media never broadcast. Ukrainian intelligence capitalized on this information gap by releasing carefully timed statements confirming operational details after Russian citizens had already documented the aftermath. This approach maximized psychological impact. Russian civilians saw Ukrainian forces operating with impunity inside Russia, while Russian authorities appeared either incompetent or dishonest in their official responses. The technical impossibility of Russian explanations became particularly evident in the Oriol incident. Russian officials initially suggested the explosives might have been planted by local dissidents or criminal elements. But the sophistication of the devices, designed to detonate during bomb disposal attempts, employing anti-handling mechanisms beyond civilian improvised explosive capability, made clear these were military-grade munitions emplaced by trained special forces, not random saboteurs. When Ukrainian media published interviews with anonymous HUR sources confirming the operations were uniquely complex joint missions between military intelligence and special operations forces, the last fig leaf of Russian deniability disappeared. These were professional military operations executed hundreds of kilometers inside Russian territory, and Moscow's security apparatus had been completely unable to prevent them. The September railway sabotage operations weren't isolated incidents. They represented one phase in Ukraine's systematic campaign to destroy Russia's logistics infrastructure across multiple domains simultaneously. Throughout 2025, Ukrainian forces had demonstrated expanding operational reach deep into Russian territory, targeting oil refineries, ammunition depots, airfields, and now railway corridors with increasing sophistication and frequency. This multi-domain logistics warfare creates a strategic dilemma Russia cannot solve. Every resource allocated to defending rear area infrastructure is a resource not available for frontline operations. Every security checkpoint slowing railway traffic reduces military cargo throughput. Every damaged facility requires repair crews, replacement equipment, and operational workarounds that strain Russian industrial capacity already buckling under international sanctions. The railway operations specifically complemented ongoing Ukrainian drone campaigns targeting Russian oil refineries and fuel storage facilities. By simultaneously attacking fuel production, fuel storage, and fuel transportation infrastructure, Ukraine creates cascading shortages that affect every aspect of Russian military operations. Artillery pieces sit idle without propellant. Tanks remain in depot without fuel for training exercises. Logistics trucks can't deliver supplies because fuel shipments never arrive. Ukrainian military doctrine has evolved to embrace this logistics-focused strategy because it achieves disproportionate effects relative to resource expenditure. A single successful railway sabotage operation costing under $200,000 can disrupt supply chains worth hundreds of millions. A drone strike destroying a fuel depot for under $50,000 can create shortages affecting multiple Russian divisions simultaneously. This approach also aligns with Ukraine's limited resources compared to Russia's numerical advantages in personnel and equipment. Ukraine cannot win a war of attrition, matching Russia tank for tank or soldier for soldier. But Ukraine can win by making Russia's tanks immobile due to fuel shortages, by making Russia's artillery silent due to ammunition supply disruptions, and by forcing Russia to disperse finite security forces protecting thousands of kilometers of vulnerable infrastructure. The economic calculus of these operations reveals why Ukrainian strategists prioritize logistics, targeting over traditional battlefield engagements. The 𝙄𝙣𝙨 railway operations cost Russia approximately $50 to $70 million in direct damages and operational disruption. But the second-order economic effects multiply that figure substantially. Railway reconstruction requires specialized steel, concrete, and engineering equipment that Russia increasingly struggles to source under international sanctions. Replacement locomotives and rolling stock must be manufactured domestically, diverting industrial capacity from military vehicle production. Security force deployments require personnel, equipment, and ongoing operational costs that strain Russian defense budgets already stretched by sustained high-intensity warfare. The psychological economic impact extends beyond measurable damages. International insurance companies reassessing risk premiums for Russian railway transport increase costs for commercial shippers. Foreign companies relying on Russian rail networks for cargo transit reduce dependency or seek alternative routes. Russian citizens witnessing infrastructure failures and security breakdowns lose confidence in government competence, creating political pressure that diverts leadership attention and resources. Sanctions, interactions multiply these effects. Russia cannot easily import replacement railway components from Western manufacturers. Chinese suppliers provide some alternatives, but at higher costs and with longer delivery timelines. Domestic production capacity exists, but operates at reduced efficiency due to shortages of specialized components, skilled workers, and advanced manufacturing equipment, all constrained by sanctions. The opportunity cost dimension is equally significant. Every ruble Russia spends repairing railway infrastructure is a ruble not spent on ammunition production, soldier training, or equipment modernization. Every engineer deployed to reconstruct damaged rail sections is an engineer not available for frontline fortification construction. Economic warfare operates through resource allocation pressure as much as through direct destruction. The psychological warfare effects of these operations ripple across multiple audiences simultaneously. For Russian military logistics officers, the attacks create existential dread. If Ukrainian forces can strike railways in Oryol and Leningrad, regions considered secure rear areas, then nowhere is truly safe. Every railway shipment becomes a potential target. Every supply convoy faces uncertainty whether it will reach its destination or end up as smoldering wreckage documented on Ukrainian social media. For Russian security services, the operations expose catastrophic intelligence failures. Ukrainian special forces teams infiltrated hundreds of kilometers into Russian territory, emplaced sophisticated explosives, evaded detection by security patrols, and successfully exfiltrated, all without Russian counterintelligence identifying the threat until explosions occurred. This suggests either Ukrainian intelligence penetration of Russian security networks or operational security failures so profound they question the entire basis of Russia's territorial defense. For Russian civilians living in affected regions, the attacks shatter the illusion that distance from Ukraine provides safety. Residents of Leningrad Oblast, over 500 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, suddenly faced train delays, security cordons, and visible evidence of military operations in their neighborhoods. The psychological message: this war isn't confined to distant front lines. It's reaching into Russia's heartland, and Moscow's security apparatus can't stop it. For Ukrainian forces and Ukrainian citizens, the successful operations provide morale boost at a critical moment. Ukraine isn't merely defending its territory. It's projecting power deep into Russia, disrupting enemy logistics, and demonstrating operational capabilities that rival or exceed Russia's despite enormous disparities in resources and territory. For international observers, particularly Western military analysts and policymakers, the operations demonstrate Ukraine's evolution from defending against Russian invasion to conducting sophisticated deep strike campaigns that fundamentally alter the strategic balance. This capability shift influences decisions about military aid, intelligence sharing, and long-term strategic support for Ukraine's defensive war. So let me ask you this. If you were a Russian logistics officer right now, looking at maps showing thousands of kilometers of vulnerable railway lines, knowing Ukrainian special forces have proven they can strike anywhere, how would you even begin to defend against this? Do you post guards every 100 meters? Do you shut down commercial traffic entirely? Do you admit that your entire logistics system has become a liability rather than an asset? Here's what I want to know from you guys in the comments. Does this change your understanding of who's actually winning this war? Because mainstream media focuses on frontline position changes measured in kilometers, but these railway operations disrupt supplies affecting hundreds of kilometers of front simultaneously. Which matters more strategically, taking one more village or shutting down the railway that supplies 20 villages? And here's the bigger question that military analysts are debating right now. If Ukraine can conduct operations like this in Oryol and Leningrad, what's stopping them from hitting railways even deeper inside Russia? The Trans-Siberian Railway? The corridors supplying Russia's Pacific Fleet? At what point does Russia's vast territory become a vulnerability rather than an advantage because they simply can't protect everything simultaneously? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I especially want to hear from anyone who thinks Russia can actually solve this problem. Because from where Ukrainian intelligence sits, this looks like a strategic weakness that only gets worse the longer the war continues. Here's what happens next, and why Russian military planners are losing sleep over it. These September railway operations established proof of concept. Ukrainian special forces can penetrate deep into Russian territory, identify high-value logistics targets, emplace sophisticated explosives, and successfully exfiltrate without detection. That capability doesn't disappear, it expands. Russian security services will implement countermeasures, increased railway patrols, more surveillance cameras, expanded inspection protocols. But every defensive measure creates its own vulnerabilities. More patrols mean predictable patterns that experienced infiltration teams can observe and evade. More cameras create blind spots between coverage zones. More inspections slow train traffic, reducing the logistics throughput that Russia desperately needs. Ukraine, meanwhile, will adapt tactics based on lessons learned. Future operations might employ even more sophisticated timing mechanisms, allowing saboteurs to emplace devices weeks before detonation and withdraw to complete safety before any explosion occurs. Remote detonation technology could enable Ukrainian operators to trigger explosives from Ukrainian territory, eliminating infiltration risk entirely. Diversionary operations in one region could distract Russian security forces while real attacks target different locations simultaneously. The precedent these operations establish extends beyond railways. If Ukrainian forces can strike railway infrastructure, they can strike pipelines, power grids, telecommunications networks, any fixed infrastructure that Russia's military depends on. The FSB cannot defend everything simultaneously. Every additional security requirement stretches Russian forces thinner, creating new vulnerabilities for Ukrainian intelligence to exploit. International implications ripple outward. Western intelligence agencies assessing Ukrainian operational capabilities see a partner that can be trusted with sensitive technology and intelligence sharing, knowing Ukraine will employ those resources effectively against Russian military targets. This accelerates deeper integration of Ukrainian forces with NATO intelligence networks, providing Ukraine access to satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and operational planning support that multiplies their already impressive capabilities. For Russia, the strategic calculation becomes increasingly grim. Continuing the war means continuing exposure to these logistics disruption operations, which will only grow more sophisticated and damaging over time. But ending the war requires admitting defeat and accepting terms that Putin's regime considers politically unacceptable. This strategic trap, unable to win, unable to end the war, unable to defend against Ukrainian deep strikes, may ultimately prove more consequential than any single battlefield defeat. Let me be absolutely clear about what we just witnessed in September 2025. Ukrainian Special Forces teams infiltrated hundreds of kilometers into Russian territory, identified critical military logistics corridors, emplaced sophisticated explosives that evaded Russian security detection, killed Russian soldiers attempting to defuse the devices, destroyed vital railway infrastructure forcing week-long closures, disrupted supplies to multiple frontline Russian units, and successfully withdrew without capture, all while Russia's massive security apparatus proved completely unable to prevent any of it. This wasn't luck. This wasn't random. This was Ukrainian military intelligence demonstrating operational superiority over Russian security services, despite fighting a defensive war against an enemy with vastly greater resources and territory. When a smaller force can project power deep into enemy territory with this level of precision and success, that's not just tactical victory. That's strategic dominance in the most important domain of modern warfare: logistics. Russia can claim whatever propaganda victories it wants about captured villages and frontline advances. But those advances mean nothing if the ammunition doesn't arrive, if the fuel runs out, if the railway bringing replacements sits destroyed with twisted rails and a crater where the track used to be. Ukrainian forces just prove they can make that happen anywhere in Russia, and Moscow has no answer. This is what happens when intelligence, courage, and operational excellence meet Russian incompetence and strategic overreach. The railway operations are a case study that will be taught in military academies for decades. How a determined defender can strike the logistics jugular of an invading force and bleed it slowly, operation by operation, until sustaining the invasion becomes economically and militarily impossible. If you made it this far, you're the kind of viewer who actually understands that wars are won through supply chains and logistics as much as through battlefield heroics. You're the person who sees past propaganda and recognizes operational reality. So here's the deal. If this breakdown helped you understand why these railway operations matter more than most frontline engagements, hit that like button right now. If you want to see the next time Ukrainian intelligence rewrites the rules of modern warfare and exposes Russian security services as the incompetent bureaucracy they are, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss it. And tell me in the comments, what surprised you most about these operations? Was it the penetration distance? The coordination between two simultaneous strikes? The fact that Ukrainian forces killed Russian soldiers trying to defuse their explosives? I want to know what stood out to you. And if you didn't like this analysis, subscribe anyway and tell me in the comments why you think I'm wrong. Tell me how Russia defends thousands of kilometers of railway track against infiltration teams with sophisticated explosives and detailed intelligence. Tell me how Moscow prevents this from happening again when they couldn't prevent it the first time. I genuinely want to hear the counter-argument, because from where Ukrainian intelligence sits, this problem only gets worse for Russia with every passing month. This is where we show you the real war. Not the sanitized press conference version, not the propaganda narrative, but the intelligence operations, the sabotage campaigns, and the logistics warfare that actually determine who wins and who loses. Where we break down the operations, proving Ukraine isn't just defending its territory, it's systematically dismantling Russia's ability to project military power. Thank you for watching. This operation demonstrates that courage, intelligence, and precision can defeat brute force and numerical superiority every single time. We'll continue tracking every Ukrainian operation that brings Russia closer to the strategic collapse its leadership refuses to acknowledge. Until next time, stay informed. Question everything you hear from Russian state media. And remember, the truth doesn't care about Moscow's propaganda.